Well, my name is Rick Joyner. I just wanted to give my greetings to the church in Bulgaria, and I've been hearing such great things about you, and I appreciate you letting me speak to you this way. And just had a couple of brief thoughts, but I think they're important ones. And in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 11. The Apostle Paul writes, "I don't want you to be unaware, brethren, how our fathers all passed under the cloud and passed through the sea, were baptized into Moses, ate the same spiritual food." He goes on and lists the things that, Israel went through in the wilderness when they were leaving Egypt and going to their promised land. And then he completes the thought with this in verse 11. He said, "Now all these things happened to them," to Israel, "as an example, but they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." So we know that the everything that Israel went through was kind of like a prophetic map or blueprint of what we go through in Christ. We're taken out of Egypt, out of our bondage, and we have a promise of a promised land that we're all seeking to go to, seeking to walk in our Christian life. And just like with them, between the place where they received the promises of God that was in Egypt and that promised land, there was a wilderness that was the exact opposite of what they were promised. They were promised a land flowing with milk and honey, but the first place they were taken, there was not even any water. And God had to provide for them supernaturally. And He didn't trick them, but this was the path to get to the promised land. Now, we go through the same things. I hear many Christians trying to claim all the promises at one time. I think it'd be smart to just claim a few at a time. They may all the promises are for us, but we've got to go through a wilderness to attain the promised land. And that wilderness that we go through for each promise is meant to mature us and prepare us to handle the promises responsibly and with faith and in obedience to the Lord, where we get closer to Him and know Him better through these experiences. So, when I hear people saying, "I was given a prophetic word that the Lord's called me to this," and you see people sometimes getting really frustrated, say it hadn't happened yet. I ran to one guy in the Czech Republic who was really upset how someone had prophesied to him 6 weeks before of what he was called to, and he was really upset that it hadn't happened in 6 weeks. He thought it was a false prophet. False prophecy. I said, wait a minute, it could be years. Look at how long it was from the time that Paul the apostle was called as an apostle until he was commissioned as an apostle. Bible scholars estimate it was between 11 and 14 years. Now, he ministered as either a prophet or a teacher or both up until that time, but until the commission came. There's a difference between the calling of God and the commissioning of God. And I think we often determine the length of time that we spend in the wilderness. They say that if Israel had been able to walk at a good pace through the wilderness, they could have made it to the promised land in about 2 weeks. Now, God wasn't going to let them get out that fast. He had things that had to be done. They had to build His dwelling place, the tabernacle in the wilderness, and many things they had to learn about God. But it was only about 2 years before they came to Kadesh Barnea when the Lord wanted them to enter, and because of their unbelief, they ended up spending another 38 years in the wilderness. I see Christians doing the same thing, where God leads them there as fast as He can when they're mature enough to go in. But often things happen and they turn back and they end up going around circles most of their life in the wilderness instead of walking in the promises. That's why it says we must make our calling and election sure. Many are called, but few are chosen. Few go on to make their calling and election sure. And so we want to do that. And don't be surprised when it seems like the opposite is happening to you. True faith gets stronger with the trials and stronger with the passage of time, not weaker. It's what it was said of Abraham in Romans, where it says, in hope against hope he believed. And he was too old when God called him, and then God made him wait 20 more years before giving him that promised son. And you can understand how he would slip occasionally and, get off track a little bit and try to do it himself. But that's a long time to stay on course, and nobody passes God's test with a perfect score. James said we all stumble in many ways. We all make mistakes. But in Jeremiah 20, Psalm 11, it talks about how the Lord tests the righteous. And we often think that when we're going through all these trials and tests, it's because of something we've done wrong. No, the opposite is the case. The Lord regards you enough to test you. And just like we take tests in school and have to pass the test to go to the next level, the same is true with the tests that God gives us. We need to pass these to go to a new level. And as one friend of mine used to say, he says, you never fail one of God's tests. You just keep taking them until you pass. I don't know about you, I'm tired of taking a lot of the same tests, going around circles in the wilderness. Let's go into the promised land. Let's take those promises. But we've got to have hearts of faith that believe to do that and to enter into the promised land. Just like Joshua and Caleb. They spied out the land. They saw the same thing that the 10 evil spies saw, but they had a whole different reaction to it. They all saw how fruitful the land was, how it was just as great as the Lord said it was, but there were giants in the land. Of course, the 10 evil spies came out saying, wow, the land is wonderful, it's awesome, just like the Lord said, but we can't take that land. There are giants in there that we look like grasshoppers next to. They're going to eat us alive. But what was the reaction of Joshua and Caleb? They saw the same thing, saw the same giants and how big they were, but they had a totally different response to what they saw. They said, yeah, there are giants in the land. That's awesome. They're going to be bread for us. It's like we get to go and conquer these giants. Because they weren't looking at how small they were in relation to the giants. They were looking at how big their God was and how much bigger he was than the giants. So whether we walk in faith is determined to a large degree on our perspective. What do we see? How do we see it? In the book of Revelation, the valley, John saw Babylon. But what did he see when he was carried to a high mountain? He saw the New Jerusalem. So I think they were both going on at the same time. A lot of what we see is determined by our perspective. Are you living life seeing how big God is and knowing how big he is? Watching him, seeing him on the throne? Or are you going through life letting the circumstances and problems and obstacles and giants in this world dictate our life and our course? Or are you doing what we're called to do, reigning in this life, which we only do as we abide in the King? Well, sure appreciate you and all of you in the churches in Bulgaria, that whole part of the world. And we know great things have already come to you and are coming from you, and look for great things in the future. And I so appreciate you letting me take this time to speak to you. Thank you. And then next time, may we both be much closer to God and seeing Him more clearly.